So welcome to the 2026 Anne Hill Blanchard Uncommon Artist Lecture. Thank you for joining us across time zones today. A quick note that captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I am Mathilde Walker-Bio. I'm curator of programs at the American Folk Art Museum. I'm joining you today from New York, and I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenape-Hawking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in our exhibitions and programs. As many of you know, the American Folk Art Museum is dedicated to celebrating the work of self-taught artists across time and space, and we're thrilled to present a new edition of the Anne Hill Blanchard Uncommon Artist Lecture, organized in honor of the late Anne Hill Blanchard, an inspiring and passionate leader in the field of folk and self-taught art, and a devoted supporter of the museum. This year, we look at the practices of Henri Rousseau from France, Gladys Mgudlandlu from South Africa, and Lalitha Lajmi from India. These three painters captured the world across the 20th century using dreamlike and symbolic language. So this lecture is an opportunity to consider the various ways artists across the globe have engaged with and responded to modernism. It also allows us to reconsider themes and ideas that are central to EFAM's modern and contemporary collection, and as well as the expanded field of self-taught art. So we'll begin with art historian and curator Nancy Ireson. Next slide, please. Nancy will present on Henri Rousseau, sharing findings from the major 2025 retrospective she co-created at the Barnes Foundation, titled Henri Rousseau, A Painter's Secrets. Her talk will be followed by a presentation by curator and art historian Nontobeko Ntombela on Gladys Mgudlandlu. So Nontobeko will share perspectives on the artist's groundbreaking painting practice, a perspective she developed through the exhibition of Fragile Archives at the Johannesburg Art Gallery in 2012. And Skye Arundhati Thomas will close the program with a presentation on Lalitha Lajmi and her self-portraits. Thomas will offer us a glimpse into her book's first critical biography published on the artist. So we're delighted to have these three writers and scholars with us today to share their research. And we invite you to share your own questions throughout the talks using the Q&A features. The feature is at the bottom of your screen, and there will be also Q&A at the end of each speaker's presentation and also at the end after our final conversation with everyone. And the program will last 2 hours, and we look forward to what you have to contribute. And I will also introduce each speaker, so you will have a sense of the program ahead of us, and I'll be using the chat room to share more information about the speakers, about the program, and so you can use that platform to share more questions, and also if you have if you need any other information. And today's program is being recorded, and the recording will be made available online in a few weeks. And again, closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Our museum is grateful for opportunities to connect online, and so that will not be possible without you. So I hope you'll consider supporting our programs through a donation to the museum after this lecture. And so now we'll begin with Nancy Ireson, will be presenting on Henri Rousseau. So hi, Nancy. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hi. So please take it away. Oh, stop first. Sorry, I need to introduce you first. Sorry about that. So Nancy Ireson is an art historian and curator with over 20 years of industry experience. She was deputy director for collections and exhibitions and Gunn Family Chief Curator at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia from 2018 to 2025. and has held curatorial positions at Tate Modern, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Courtauld Gallery, and the National Gallery in London. Exhibitions she has curated and co-curated include Henri Rousseau Painter's Secrets, that will be the center of our presentation today. Suzanne Valadon, model painter and rebel, Modigliani, as well as other exhibitions. And Ireson holds a PhD on Henri Rousseau from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and MBA from the Alliance Manchester Business School. So thank you so much for joining us today, Nancy, and please take it away.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Mathilde. It's really exciting to join you today from Paris, where the second stage of the exhibition will be held. It's opening this week. So if you need an excuse to visit Paris this spring, this is it. It will be on from March 24th to July 20th. And it really is an exciting moment to see Rousseau's work. We have a really fantastic array of more than 50 pictures. So if you didn't see the show in Philadelphia, this is a second opportunity. But what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today is this idea of Rousseau's secrets, things we don't know about Rousseau. And this is working in two ways. Some of this is about Rousseau as a person, and some of this is about Rousseau's practice, Rousseau as a painter. And one thing I'm really excited about is that in Paris, we are able to start the exhibition with a major self-portrait by Rousseau. This was painted by the artist in 1890. It shows him dominating the city of Paris. And it's a modern Paris. You've got the Eiffel Tower in the background. You've got a hot air balloon in the distance there. Rousseau paints himself very much as a professional. And originally, the picture was even bigger. If you can sort of see a ghostly shadow around Rousseau, that was the size of his body in the first version. The journalists found it quite funny. Rousseau doctored it down. But what we have is Rousseau asserting himself, asserting an image of himself as a painter. But as we all know, the images that we project aren't always completely authentic. And that's something we enjoyed working with in this exhibition. The idea that Rousseau was somebody who was quite entrepreneurial, who projected himself as a professional in order to make a career. And to fully understand this, it's helpful to know a little bit about the artist. He was born in 1844 in provincial France. And like a lot of young people, moved to Paris, as a young man. He'd had quite a sort of shaky start. He'd had a small time in prison for stealing from his employer. He'd lived through a very traumatic time, really. Paris in the 1870s experienced civil war, and there was the Franco-Prussian War. So Rousseau didn't actually fight, but he had seen a lot of terrible things happen. And he'd lost a lot of children. He outlived two spouses, had several children who died in infancy. So really, this is somebody who had lived quite a tough life, who had experienced extreme poverty. And yet a lot of this just is totally absent from his pictures. So I want you to hold that idea as we talk through the pictures today, because I think it helps us to get a little bit closer to him as a practitioner and what the works might mean. This is a wonderfully small canvas that's in the Courtauld Gallery in London. It's in the show in Paris. It was in Philadelphia just recently. And it shows the kind of place that Rousseau worked before he became an artist. He didn't become a professional artist till he was in his late 40s. So, there's hope for us all. And he imbues it with a sort of poetry. It doesn't seem as if this is a specific location. It is a generic toll gate of the kind that Rousseau would have worked at. His day job for much of his life was collecting tariffs on goods that were coming in and out of Paris. And you see this wonderful separation of spaces, the sort of wild beyond the gates and the order within the gates, or vice versa. But often I think you do get this in Rousseau, this sense of spanning worlds. And And again, taking something quite ordinary and making it something exceptional. Again, to tap into this idea of biography, we can think about Rousseau as somebody who had deep beliefs. A journalist called Arsène Alexandre visited him in 1910, came to Rousseau's studio in 1910 and asked Rousseau about this picture, which he'd made many years earlier. It was still in the studio. And Rousseau talked about it as a spiritualist picture. So what we see here is Rousseau and his second wife. And in the clouds above their heads, just in the blue there, their late spouses are watching over them. It's a rather wonderful picture. And Rousseau is holding forget-me-nots. He was very interested in the language of flowers. So this is a picture about remembering. It's about honoring the past, but also moving forward. And so it starts to help us make sense of why sometimes people made fun of Rousseau. There were lots of stories about him believing in ghosts. But some of these things do have a logical root and something that was not entirely unusual in the 19th century. Rousseau had a lot of friends who were interested in spiritualism. He probably went to meetings, and interestingly was spanning different worlds. And you get a sense of this again in this picture. Here Rousseau is anything but a bohemian. He is an upright middle class person. The palette's nowhere to be seen. It's a painterly equivalent of your Sunday best. It really is projecting an image of what Rousseau aspired to be or felt he was. Now, despite the fact that Rousseau had this very personal painting practice, and he clearly cared about pictures because he gave up conventional work in order to paint, he really did need to make a living from that work. And this is something that we found out more about in the technical research that the Barnes Conservation Team, which is led by Barbara Buckley, did in preparation for the opening of the show in Philadelphia. And Christopher Green, my co-curator, wonderful Rousseau specialist, also wrote about this in the exhibition catalogue. And Chris Green believes this is a picture of Rousseau's mother. It has a spire in the background which looks like the church in Laval, which was his hometown. And the portrait was made at the time of Rousseau's second marriage. So there may be this sense of remembering in a broader way. But again, if you start to look at the sky in this image, you might sense that there's something beneath that blue. And the X-radiographs that Barbara's team took revealed that beneath the surface of the picture, there was a full portrait of a child. And in fact, the little flowers that we see around the woman's feet in Woman in a Landscape, which is a painting at the Barnes, those flowers actually seem to have been from the first painting. And what we get from this is a sense that Rousseau was quite resourceful. Perhaps this was a portrait of a child that somebody had commissioned. Maybe they didn't collect it. Maybe they didn't like it. Rousseau reuses that surface, and he saves on paint by not going over the whole thing. He's being very resourceful. And some of the things he talks about to the people around him, like his art dealer, later in life, a man called Wilhelm Moeder, he gets excited when he's in discussions about working with a gallery, because he might get a salary, and he tries to negotiate some paid time off. He was really thinking about work as you might think of any other kind of work, in terms of what you put in, what you might get out of it. And this isn't to deny the absolute passion that's there. I mean, clearly he loved what he was doing, but that need to make a living is constant. And he was ambitious, he wanted to paint for the authorities. This canvas War was shown in the Independent Salon, which is one that anybody could show at, but it was clearly designed to attract a bigger, more important audience. Rousseau was always writing letters to the president or the mayor of Laval, all sorts of people just trying to get him to paint pictures, to buy the pictures rather. But what he does instead is he attracts Bohemian audience. Alfred Jarry, the playwright, loves this painting and commissions a print of it. And interestingly now, what we see is Rousseau, from the 1819 onwards, really playing between the audience that he perhaps first wanted to get the the official commissions and what have you, to pandering instead to a younger, more forward-thinking, a more left-wing audience, potentially. However, again, what we see then is him sort of shuttling between these worlds. This is a commission, we think, probably from the widow of the man in white. This probably was a soldier, a man called Froment-Spiche. Rousseau made another portrait of him. But here, it's a very sober picture. There's no sense of wanting to do anything particularly unconventional. He was probably working from a photograph. And when Rousseau writes to a poet that he knows, a man called Apollinaire, he talks about breaking off his big salon paintings in order to make little pictures to sell. So we get a feel for this kind of workaday commission, helping him to pay the bills. Perhaps sometimes he's exchanging paintings for services, just in order to keep himself going while he's still aspiring to greater things. This was a picture that he made in the hope of getting a commission to decorate a town hall in Paris. That was something that was quite popular in the 1890s. There are a lot of competitions to decorate public buildings. When Barbara's team analysed this picture, and I've got to give credit here to Mina Perel and Anya Shatova, they found these three arches underneath the surface. And Christopher Green was able to link this in with the competition. Rousseau had effectively made an image that would have spanned the wall, but he didn't win. He wasn't successful, didn't even get through the first round of the competition. So he repurposes the canvas in order to sell it. There's something very practical at work there. And so many living artists that I've met who love Rousseau can relate absolutely to this sense of, playing the cards you're dealt. How do you keep going and keep working, really? Some of the pictures are probably made in exchange for goods or services. This is a man called Père Junier, who was a grocer, who also trained horses in his spare time. So we know that the horse was called Rosa, kind of quite fun. And we think now from the exhibition research, and you can see this in the catalogue entries, that the rabbit was probably a family pet of the Juniers, because the Delaunay's, the painter Robert Delaunay and Sonia Delaunay, said that these two were found together at the grocer's home. So that's a nice time. But again, gives you a feel for this very different world to the one that we might associate with Rousseau, the sort of the likes of Picasso and people that later sang his praises. This is just to give you a feel of how we put some of these works together in our show in Philadelphia. Here you have some of these small landscapes. And it, again, we really wanted to create a sort of feeling of the domestic in this space. Our exhibition designer, Yomu Huang, did a really great job of just making this feel really intimate. And it's a total contrast between the next space, which was dedicated to jungle pictures. And that's really what we tend to think of, I think, when we think of Rousseau. When we look at these, it's helpful to remember that in 1903, Gauguin had died. Paul Gauguin had made his name by painting the Society Islands, giving French viewers a taste of far-off places, with all the colonial baggage that went with that. Rousseau taps into that trend, and when he makes this picture in 1904, it gets him an invitation to show at a selective salon the next year. And we see from then on, he really leans into making these jungles. And they're really called to the imagination. I mean, this picture is so wonderful. You get that feeling of conflicting light sources. You know, it's the light behind the picture, it's in front of the picture. Why is the tiger so enormous? Rousseau really pushes the boundaries of plausibility. And I think that this has got to have been something that just really appealed to a young artist in a world that was increasingly rational and yet probably made less and less sense. Here's how the jungles looked in Philadelphia. This is just a taste of the room. This is expanded even further in Paris, and it's just thrilling to be in that space. I mean, if you have a chance, I would really urge you to come and take a look. Just incredible loans from Chicago, Washington, Virginia, Basel. Those are just the ones you can see here. But it really is a really special moment to see the works. And particularly too, I want you to be able to experience these three pictures together. And this is the finale of the show. It shows three pictures that not even Rousseau himself saw in his lifetime. The Sleeping Gypsy from the Museum of Modern Art, the Unpleasant Surprise from the Barnes, and the Snake Charmer from the Musée d'Orsay. And these pictures are full of mystery. They ask us to invent stories. In none of them are we sure what's going on. With the Sleeping Gypsy, is the woman in danger? Is this a real scene? Are we in her dream? This captured the imagination of the surrealists when it was rediscovered in the 20s. Funnily enough, it had disappeared after it was shown in the 1890s, and it was found in a charcoal merchant shop. So it had this extraordinary trajectory, but came to light again at a moment when some years after Rousseau's death, when the artist had become very popular. Again, Unpleasant Surprise now, which you can see having undergone a wonderful conservation treatment by the team at the Barnes. This is the first time you'll see any of the Barnes pictures in the show for more than a century, because it's only just recently the Barnes has been able to lend. This partnership with the Orangery brings the two biggest Rousseau collections in the world together. So it's really exceptional. Dr. Barnes bought a lot of works by Rousseau, including this one in the 1920s, 18 in all. And he purchased them through a man called Paul Guillaume. And Paul Guillaume's collection is the basis of the Orangery. So what you have in this institutional partnership are those two players brought together. But here, again, what is happening? Is the bear more dangerous than the hunter? We just can't tell. It's a really strange picture. And again, there's always that sort of underlying sense of threat. And again, the snake charmer, a later picture, but it shows how that sort of elusive part of Rousseau is there. And we don't want to deny the mystery of the artist. If anything, we're leaning into it. But I hope, today and in the exhibition and the book, we've given you a chance to think about those different layers of secrecy within Rousseau and what some of the motivations might have been. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for guiding us through the fabulous world of Rousseau and sharing some of his secrets, or at least asking us to ask questions about his work and the interpretation of the work. So that was really helpful and brilliant. So thank you. I maybe ask a few questions. I can see that we have already some questions from the audience, but to kick us off, I wanted to, because you ended with this with talking about the conversation about the exhibition itself and at the Barnes and how exceptional this exhibition is. It was one of the major retrospective of the work in the US. So I was wondering if you can talk about the context of making this exhibition possible and what the key factors are entered in its development and why you think now it was a good moment to do this retrospective.
It was really the perfect moment to embark upon a Rousseau project because It was just a couple of years ago that the Barnes Foundation, we were able to make the lending terms more flexible. So up until very recently, pictures could not leave the Barnes Foundation's collection galleries. But there was a 2-day court process, and because of the educational mission of the Barnes, we made a case about effectively being able to learn more through lending pictures. And this really is a wonderful demonstration of that by allowing works from the biggest Rousseau collection in the world to join forces with major works from the Orangery and from other institutions, you start to understand the entirety of the work, and you see it on its own terms. And there's something really wonderful about seeing the displays at the Barnes. If you don't know them, I do look them up online, because there's a wonderful array of lots of different works, and it's non-hierarchical, and it's a really exciting display. But it does something very different to a monographic dive into an artist's work. And so this was the perfect launch project. And I was really excited when I asked Christopher Green to come and work with us. And I talked to Christophe Leribaud, who at the time was the director of the Orsay, and they were able to flex their schedule in order for us to do this project as a real watershed moment for lending. So as I say, I worked on a Rousseau show 20 years ago, which was co-curated by Francis Morris and Christopher Green. And in that show, we weren't able to have either of those collections. So although we were able to gather amazing pictures from all sorts of different places, and that show was in London and Paris and Washington, this show has these really major works that we couldn't factor in at that time.
Yes, you mentioned that. So you have Sleeping Gypsy, Unpleasant Surprise, and the Snake Charmer for the first time in the same room. And which are like the three major cool masterpiece from the artist. So as a curator and a long fan of Rousseau, because it looks like you did also your PhD on Rousseau. So how did you feel to have all these works together in the same room? And how did he also maybe change your own understanding and experience of the work?
Well, it's just been thrilling. The three of us as curators, myself and Chris and Juliette Dijen, we can't get over the fact that they're in the same room. I mean, we saw them in Philadelphia. They're reinstalled differently in Paris, but they're still in the same space. And it really is, it's spine-tingling. I mean, they're just such powerful pictures, and it gives you a feel for Rousseau having made a deliberate choice to keep us guessing. Yeah, they are such mysterious works, and they resist interpretation. I love visitors coming in and sharing their ideas about what the works might mean. Visitors of all ages. They are works that have this. They're just beguiling pictures. So that side of it really is brought home very strongly when you see them together. But I think also you get a real sense for his beautiful grasp of color. There is a real sensuality to his palette. And the Museum of Modern Art, Michael Duffy in the Conservation Studios there did a marvelous treatment on that picture during the pandemic. And you really again see the colors singing out. So to see the three together is just very special.
That's that's amazing. I was also wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this place of Rousseau in the history of the Barnes Foundation, because as you mentioned, there was about 18 paintings by Rousseau acquired during the lifetime of Dr. Barnes. And so if you can talk a little bit more about the history of this acquisition, but also the history of Rousseau in this agenda, the intellectual and also artistic agenda of the foundation, and also the modernist agenda of Barnes.
It's really fascinating that Barnes was so enamored with self-taught artists. Well, like this community, in fact, like all of us. But I think for Barnes, it helped him to make a particular social point. Barnes had come from a blue collar background. He had done incredibly well. He'd become a very rich man, but he really believed very strongly in equality, and he wanted his galleries and his teaching program to be very equitable, which was not a given in Philadelphia in the 1920s. So there was something very admirable about that. You know, even if sometimes Barnes went about things in rather strange ways, the the ethos there was a really strong one. And self-taught artists really helped him to do that. This idea that there are just really strong artistic traditions in the world, and that it isn't necessarily something that is taught. It is something that is um, built on visual awareness of being attuned to your surroundings. Barnes believed very strongly in visual literacy, and Rousseau helped him to discuss that. You know, when he wrote about Rousseau, there are two. If you're interested in delving in, if you're on the call and you're interested in delving into this in particular, I'd point you to there's a brilliant essay by Chris Green in the catalogue, which is about Rousseau's appreciation of Barnes, but also the work that Catherine Gentleson did at the High Museum on gate crashes, which talks about Barnes and his self-taught collecting, because it was at that moment where in the US there was interest in John Keane, and you know, and so many self-taught figures. Barnes collected Horace Pippin, so it also takes Rousseau out of that European art context and brings him into the US sphere. And it's interesting. It's also worth saying that the first Rousseau gallery show was in the States. You know, Max Weber organized that at the 291 galleries with some pictures. The painter Max Weber had bought some works from Rousseau when he was in Paris as a young man, and he was so excited about it, he brought it to New York. Very modest, but just sort of sowed those seeds early on.
Yes, it's definitely an audience for Rousseau in the US, and very early on, and he has a special place also in the history of modernism in the US. Can you talk a little bit more about the area of research that you are exploring in the future about Rousseau? I see that's a question by Valérie Rousseau, who's one of the curators at the American Folk Art Museum. So maybe if you can talk a little bit more about the areas of research that you want to continue explore in your study of Rousseau.
There are two areas that I find particularly interesting. One that we started to work with in the show, but I feel has more mileage, is the idea of Rousseau's social position and what that means in terms of interpretation, but actually also what it means in terms of the decisions he makes. I think there's a lot of interesting writing at the moment by sociologists who are looking at the splintering of the lower middle classes in the present day. You know, the political volatility. You know, how does individualism make for instance, voting tendencies less predictable? It's interesting because you sense that's already an issue in the 19th century. You've got the workers, you've got the flaneurs, you've got the sort of the elite. But Rousseau is in this space where he has something to lose and something to gain, which is an interesting space to occupy, and one which is increasingly large. And I think this, you know, perhaps is why he's sort of pandering to whichever audience he can, you know, find work with. But again, it's something I think I would like to lean into a little bit more, because I think it may be part of what makes Rousseau feel quite contemporary these days. And that's not something that I had really tuned into when I started thinking about Rousseau 25 years ago. He seems ahead of his time, but I think it's interesting to sort of drill into those different aspects. And then the other thing I've been interested in for a while, but I continue to be interested in is the Salon des Indépendants, so this independent exhibition that anybody could be in. You just had to pay an entrance fee. And Rousseau wouldn't have had a career without that. So again, what are those vehicles for artists to make their careers?
We have many questions. I'll take a few before we turn to our next speaker to think more about his position in his time. We have a question about his position during the Paris Commune in 1871, 1872. So maybe if you can talk a bit more about that, if you have any information about this.
We don't know much about the specifics of his belief, whether he was, a communard or not. But I think what you do get a sense of is the narrative shifting slightly depending on who he's talking to. So there are times where he is, a good son of the Republic and a good patriot. And actually, I mean, there's an interesting painting in the Picasso Museum, which Picasso bought, and it has a monument in the background. And Dexter Dell would know this one really well, but it has a humanist martyr in the background. He was a sort of a martyr to free thinking, and it's Rousseau in this painting deliberately doesn't show you Notre Dame. He could have included that in the view. So the cathedral isn't there, and the monument to free thinking is there. So there are times where we really get a sense of his politics, but then he clearly has a fondness for spirits, and he potentially paints his mother in front of a church. So there are these kind of contradictions within the way he's working. But certainly, I mean, he did live in Paris through the siege of Paris, through the Commune, so he would have seen the bodies lined up and dealt with the hardships of that time. I mean, people in Paris were so hungry they were eating the animals in the zoo. It's kind of, we sort of forget how brutal it must have been.
Thank you. Maybe one more thing about his time, and also the fact that he was hanging out and speaking with poets and the circle, as you said, the Bohemian circle of his time. So we have a question about his relationship to the poet Apollinaire and the avant-garde circle. So if you can just mention that, and we'll continue this conversation about how Rousseau was also received and his discussion with other artists later in the conversation. But yeah, if you can respond to that question about Apollinaire.
I mean, Guillaume Apollinaire, the poet, has an interesting relationship with Rousseau. So at first, in his art criticism, Apollinaire also writes reviews of shows. He's quite rude about Rousseau to start with. You get the sense reading between the lines that he can't see what all the fuss is about. But Apollinaire is very attached to Picasso and the young avant-garde, and they clearly like Rousseau. So he spends more time with him and actually agrees to get his portrait painted. So there are two versions of a portrait of Apollinaire with his then girlfriends, the painter Marie Laurencin. And through those sittings, there's a correspondence between Apollinaire and Rousseau. And after Rousseau's death in 1910, Apollinaire actually publishes those letters and other articles about Rousseau in a journal that he was working on called Les Soirées de Paris, Paris Evenings. And that is actually really helpful because this back and forth from Apollinaire and Rousseau gives us a feel for the working artist again. He gets cross with Apollinaire for not turning up for the sittings. He wants the picture to be ready in time. Sometimes his French, which is by and large pretty respectful, gets a little bit, you can see the impatience coming through. And he's often asking Apollinaire for help, or for financial help. Again, one thing we wanted to bring out in the show was that, Rousseau runs up really bad debts. So he's in court in the early 20th century for debts to his colour merchant. He's involved in a big bank fraud in 1908. So there's always this kind of pressing money worry. But Apollinaire really gives us a feel for some of the sadness of Rousseau too. I mean, he writes this really touching poem about having a drink with Rousseau and and seeing the wounds on Rousseau's legs. He had real health kind of troubles by the end of his life. So I think Apollinaire did on some level understand that there were these different sides to this person.
Great, thank you so much for leading us through the fabulous world of Henri Rousseau. Our next speaker will talk about another extraordinary artist from South Africa. Hello, Nontobeko, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to briefly introduce you. So Nontobeko Ntombela has worked at various institutions, including the Art for Humanity BAT Center, Durban University Art Gallery, and the Johannesburg Art Gallery. In 2012, Nontobela assumed an academic position at the University of the Witwatersrand Schools of Art. Since joining WITS, her curatorial practice has shifted from community-based projects to more archivally research-led historical curatorial approaches. Some of her most notable curatorial projects include Then I Knew I Was Good at Painting, Esther Mahanlugu, a retrospective in 2024 at Iziko National Gallery and Wits Art Museum. When Rain Clouds Gather, South African Black Woman Artist, 1940-2000, at the Norval Foundation in Cape Town, and in 2022, and a Fragile Archive in 2012 at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, which will be the center of this presentation today. Nontobeko is the 2025 winner of the South African National Arts and Culture Awards for Outstanding Curator. And she serves on the Johannesburg Art Gallery Acquisitions Committee. And it's a pleasure to have you with us today. And you will be presenting on Gladys Mgudlandlu. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm encouraged by this image with sunshine as it is evening at this particular moment. And thank you for that lovely introduction. For today's presentation, I thought to engage with Gladys Nomfanekiso from the three perspectives that I've been exploring, which is thinking about the struggle with archives and wrestling with the potentials of what we find and how we knit those stories together. So how do we remember sort of scattered, dismembered information on artists that define our artistic practice? And I thought what might be interesting to start with is one of the very first declaration of my own positionality is to think through a feminist lens. And Erin Silver, who's published a book that's come out really recently on art and feminism, histories and methods and legacies, to which I have a chapter, asked, I think, a very important question here: to whom do we owe feminist art historical genealogies of the past, and how might we return to complicate and expand feminist art histories in the future, and how might we plot histories of feminist art otherwise? And I do apologize for a very text-heavy presentation. It's just my own way of remembering, as I only see one screen at a time. With this in mind, and thinking about archives and their challenges, and thinking about how we engage with art histories, many people probably in this room would know the kind of fractured histories South Africa comes from. And so particular ways of thinking around art history in this day and age, layered with thinking back from an archival point of view. And 2012, when I engaged with Gladys's work and produced the exhibition, A Fragile Archive, it's kind of been a very important moment, which I ask myself the question, to whom does my research speak back to? And these questions linger on and have carried some of the works that I've done, such as When Rain Clouds Gather, Black South African women artists from the 40s to 2000, which I co-curated with Portia Malachi, was another place in which we had about 80 women artists trying to lay out a narrative around Black women artists' practices from this period and what that might look like. And to our surprise, of course, we didn't realize how enormous the challenge and the project we had put ourselves into. It was an interesting moment to see the kind of offerings Black women artists have in South Africa been wrestling with, and provided us with, in terms of art historical narratives that also lay out an understanding of the country's history, of visibilities and invisibilities of women, political contributions of artists from these positionalities. The same goes into the work I've done in Brantford, the permanent exhibition on Winnie Mandela's life in banishment at a town called Brantford, where she spent almost 9 years being banned after the Soweto uprising. It's questions of how do we remember these figures, and how do we remember with our positionalities intact, to ask different questions that may not be prevalent. The last exhibition, or recent exhibition, when then I knew I was good at painting the same, when we have an artist like Esther Mahlangu, who is known through particular narratives of what's often wrestling with this idea of craft. Her practices of umgwalo offered me a place to sit with questions around these modalities, as offerings of creative practices that are beyond just cultures, are beyond just communities and the limitations of our communities, and how do we think of what Esther Mahlangu has offered through her rebellion position to think beyond the tradition. And so, in thinking about today, and my apologies for all these disclaimers, I think it kind of would then, I'm hoping it helps us think about how I present Gladys and Gladys's work, that I think through harder questions around positionalities of Black women artists' visibilities. And so thinking about the idea of incumbent methods of recuperation, Carolyn Hamilton and her colleagues have always kind of helped one think about this idea of self-reflexivity, a feminist retrieval and solidarity, to think about how we listen in and listen to artist positionalities. And so Carolyn Hamilton, therefore, asked, the archive is also always already being refigured. The technologies of creation, preservation, and use, for instance, are changing all the time. Physically, the archive is being added to, subtracted from, and is in dynamic relationship with physical environments. Because organizational dynamics are ever shifting, and the archive is porous to societal processes and discourses, although at certain junctures, like the one in which South Africa finds itself now, formal conduits needs to be in place. So how do we meet these histories together? In the same way, and to speak to the kind of the fever, one would term it, in South Africa, where the kind of revisioning, returning to these artists anew, has meant that there's an expectation of particular kinds of findings, but Dimitri Erasmus reminds us that there's no past waiting in time to be retrieved for preservation, no immaculate past waiting for our return, no past waiting for blame. There's only our interrogation of what we find of what you come to know about history and what we can make of, and with this coming to know in our attempts to human the future. So thinking about these three stances, self-reflexivity, feminist retrieving, and solidarity and curatorial listening, Gladys was for me an important turning point, where as a young curator, I was quite intrigued to understand what visibilities of Black women and where they would start. And for a large part of writing at the time, Gladys kept on being returned to as one of the pioneers of the time. In fact, I will later go into how her position has been claimed as the first. So she comes in to being recognized as an artist at the age of 47, with her first exhibition at the Liberal Party. And of course, this informs us in many ways about how she then really navigates the art world from there onwards. She lived in Nyanga Township, now known as Gugulethu in Cape Town, and she is said to have been an art teacher. Started off as a nurse, became an art teacher, worked as an artist by night and a writer of folklore. She comes from Pedi, Skye, and she's known to and has grown up with her grandmother, who they were located in an area, a missionary area of the African Methodist Church. And there, which is interesting, of course, that this has a bearing in the way that she then presented her work, I think, which still offers a potential area of research that the many writers have not yet gone into, and I'll go into that later. What's interesting, of course, with artists of the time is that this idea of date of birth can be contentious, with many records and the formalizing of birth records being something that comes with the colonialist approach, and a kind of dismissal of values of those, and people really thinking of them very differently. And so the idea of her being born in 1970, 1925, 1927, I think is very interesting place of thinking about this idea of identity, dates, age, and so forth. She's trained as a nurse, went to Loveday College in Alice, which is also important in the sense that a lot of the time artists of her generation who would have been taught at home, but particular basic crafts that were for functioning items. Gladys also gets exposed to missionary schooling in South Africa, which we know also has an influence in the kind of artistic practice, and many artists that we know from the 1920s who had been exposed to missionary training that included art. She started off as a nurse, and due to a fractured leg, then changed over to teaching, where she then pursued her art career. Interestingly enough, in the 1960s, and of course this is not so long ago, but in a South African context, an artist of her caliber to be appearing in the 60s meant that you are also pioneering in a particular kind of visibility, particularly of Black women artists. Of course, the Sekotos had appeared in the 20s, and many Simon Ngonis were already known in the early 1900s. But really, for longest time, we were held by this idea that Black women were not artists, which writers like Brenda Schmaman and Mitra Nettleton and Arnold have challenged, in the sense that what these ideas were proposing was that artists, in the kind of formalistic traditional sense, were not seen as artists, and so craft and the so-called fine arts still carry a particular kind of debate in South Africa, where visibilities are debated in that sense. But to imagine then Gladys being this artist in the 60s and pushing her career in this particular way. She gets an award in 1963 in Durban. She has a solo show in PE. She's moving up and down between Cape Town and Johannesburg. suddenly gives us a different kind of mapping and a way that she maneuvered the world, but also remembering that she is appearing. Her first solo exhibition is within a particular kind of liberal community that facilitated particular ways of herself being able to move in the art world. And here you see most of the time her work being referred to artists who are international artists. We've heard about Rousseau, recently Chagall, Kandinsky, Grandma Moses were often names that her work was being compared to. Of course, these were loose references, but it was in a way speaks to who was receiving her work and who was positioning her work. Elsa Miles, who writes a monograph on her in 2002, speaks about how she sees this mixture between expressionism and impressionism in her work, and she said herself and described herself as a dreamer, imaginist. And to me, we see this radical imagination, we see this self-determination, we see this woman who's even able to write her own life into text. She was a writer, and here's an example of her trying to reflect on her own life and positioning herself. Pardon the background noise. I've tried to, I didn't do so well in terms of going into each work singularly. I've tried to make groupings here to kind of give a sense of some of the themes that come through her work in this exploration of, she produced a lot of work that have since emerged after Elsa Miles's exhibition Land and Lives in 1889, that travel from Johannesburg to Cape Town. We see a lot of artists, Black artists, who suddenly get recouped or represented to the public in this new democratic moment, gain certain kinds of attention. And later on, we see her having an exhibition in 2002, again curated by Elsa Miles. What we then begin to see is her style, her focuses, and the attention that she was given. Her name is Nomfanekiso, which is derived from, in simple terms, means a picture. And she's also had a nickname, Nontaga, which basically one who enjoys birds. And you see her really working a lot with birds that are identifiable from a certain region, the oyster catchers from seaside, which would have been locating her within the Eastern Cape region, particular birds and mountains that are also kind of, in a way, she never returns to the rural areas after leaving when she went to pursue nursing. So she left the Eastern Cape and went to Cape Town, and that's where she lived for the rest of her life. And if we then understand that she makes a lot of her work at the age of 47 after having had a career as a nurse, and now she's a teacher, many of these images and illustrations are really from her imagination, and these illustrious landscape of the rural landscape seem to be locating the rural areas. Quite for me, which was really interesting, was to see how she had captured the interest of a lot of writers at the time, and some of them really struggling with accepting the looseness at which she produces work, the speed at which she produces work, the subject matter she was making, the very famous critique of Bessie Head, critiquing her work as being produced to deliver for a particular audience and taste, being critiqued for not having a political edge to her work. There was also a sense that she was holding a particular position in the art scene for this period, because she is an artist from 61, or first solo show, and she dies in 79. And so this period, and in fact, up until 71, she stopped having exhibition because she fell ill. And so you have this decade of her intensity really capturing a lot of public attention in the newspapers and the work she was producing, having a lot of exhibitions, recording this life that was both of her own environment, but also this imagination, illustration of things that were not of her immediate environment. So this image of the two, the bride and the groom, would have been, yes, we do not have the landscape background of where, but the kind of traditional attires would have been more frequent in her hometown. The illustration of still lives, and you can see here some of the influences, and I'll speak to that. Another kind of so themes that you see, a lot of the flora and fauna that you see in her work, the kind of lush trees, the landscape, these figures that are always kind of disappearing into the field, and always in traditional attire. These figures are always one that somehow situates this this nostalgia to the role, this escape into the role. You see her, and you don't see most of these a lot, but sometimes you see the kind of Xhosa homestead, which have been the rural areas. So landscape becomes an important point and kind of genre for Gladys, and she becomes known for it, so much so that in one of the publications that Elsa Miles produces, and we see the influences once again from some of the liberals that had been buying her work, creating opportunities for her to have an exhibition. She exhibited quite a lot in a gallery, which was at one floor downstairs, a furniture shop, and upstairs a gallery space, the Roden Gallery, which was owned by now. Then was a woman gallerist. She's from Jerusalem, and you see this change in her work, and these encouragements that happen when Ray Alexandra sort of encouraged her to think about her own environment, the township. Again, the work here, which would have been the Cape Town scene, some of these works are undated, and it becomes interesting to understand when do these influences change in her work. But you then have these records that say she was producing images of the city landscape, and this city landscape illustrates a particular kind of density that, if you think about the critique she's getting from Bessie Head and Tinkulatis, from the local newspapers, who are saying she's not producing the scenes of the township. She's not illustrating to us the hardship of her environment or Black communities. Why is she focusing on the city? You see this when she turns again to the township, producing her own environment, this kind of sinking houses, almost as if absorbed by the landscape on top of each other, is quite an interesting turn to her own space. Still, often you would find very few of these township landscape or city landscape with people, where in fact then the rural landscape would have shown us these images of the figures of people in the background. Here again, and debates that have come in sharp focus around her work, which is around landscape, and what this landscape sharply tells us about ways in which apartheid systems structured, ways in which people moved around to remember the rural areas. And so Gladys Mgudlandlu's capturing of these landscapes for Zama, for instance, were an illustration of this nostalgic return to the so-called homelands. And she articulates the kind of leap, the new genre that Gladys is able to offer without restriction. She doesn't necessarily restrict herself to the evidently political work, but when we think about the ways in which the rural landscape and the rural imagination, the way that people related to art, here Zama argues that we then see a particular kind of political stance. And so to think of this woman artist who's navigating the 60s in a particular way, this is at the tipping point where we are seeing a lot of the political intensification, the Women's March, which really captivated South Africa and changed a lot of the thinking around positions of women. We think about the Sharpeville massacres in the 1960s, the definition of how Black people are navigating their positionality. There's something daring about a woman artist who's seeing herself, positioning herself. In one of the archives, I found documents, that illustrated that one had to get permission to go out of the township into the city and back into the city for both parties, those who lived in the cities and those who lived in the township. And for her to have had this kind of strength to be able to move and have this kind of public arrest in such intensities and own it to that, where you see her being able to locate her own voice whenever she's mentioned in the newspapers, sort of shows you that she was aware of her own positionality and what she was offering to the world. And so the kind of apolitical argumentation around her world, these birds, these landscapes, both of the township, of the rural, of the city, suddenly tell us there's much more to think about when it comes to her work, that there wasn't only this naivety of producing pretty pictures for the audience of the liberal community that had been captured by her work. And this is just an indication that in the time she had, she became an artist in the 60s to the 79, you see how much work she was able to go through. And so the idea of voice, self-determination, and one of self-identification for me has lied in this place of a requirement to think and step into engaging with her work from a particular feminist position in engaging this decolonial moment. You see the attraction that her work has been able to draw, where we see the first exhibition in 1961. She is reintroduced back into the South African art scene in 1997 and 98, and you see her getting a retrospective in 2002, my return to her work in 2012, and then, of course, which I found quite exciting in the work of Gemang Waleolere, who spends time going to her house. He is from the same township, grew up in the same township. Gugulethu was able to track down her home to see what could have been, what that environment looked like, and worked with the conservator to be able to dig and excavate a mural from a palimpsest of plaster and paint of her house. All of this narrated by the artist aunt, who was able to remember the artist from her youth. And so her voice becomes important. The tracking of her work becomes important. To return to the archive, because of course, when I was looking for the work that appeared in her 1961 exhibition, all I had was a piece of paper that had a list of artworks. And as we know, works that get resale, they get given descriptive names. The date of 1 year could have meant there is a whole lot of changes that happened with the work. I was able to then return and be able to speak to that voice. The example here of Kimangole Lehulera's intervention with the return to her home and being able to relate to this history. Just in closing, again, the big questions that still capture my interest in the artist, what are these boundaries of recuperation? When we think about politically and epistemologically, for whom is the research and who benefits from it? Could design an impulse, a disciplinary mode of engagement for coherence and visibility of unintentionally reproduce the very logic of surveillance and categorization that shape art historical writing? These are questions for me that in thinking about her work, I constantly ask myself. And so self-reflexivity, this idea of feminist retrieval, solidarity, and curatorial listening continues to capture my interest in Gladys Mgudlandlu. So I'll end it there. I think I've gone over my time.
Thank you so much for this presentation and also for giving us some tools to approach Mgudlandlu in a critical and historical way. So it's very, very great to have you leading us through her work. I would love to speak a little bit before I share some questions from our audience about the fact that because if I understood well, Mgudlandlu was trained by a grandmother in mural art and also in clay sculpture from the Xhosa traditions. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about these indigenous South African traditions, cosmology, and traditions, and how you see them inform some of the work of Mgudlandlu. Oh, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. Sorry, I'm sorry for going over time. Now I made myself nervous.
Yes, exactly. It's like silence.
She is from a community defined as Amamfengu, which would have been a breakaway community from Lushaga's domination into Bondoland, Amaxhosa, received by King Yenza. And in a sense, they were a nomad community in that sense. And hence you find that they would lived in these protected areas of the missionaries. So one of the things that I think I said is very interesting that still needs to be researched is very much what does the Mfengu identification look like? Because of course they're absorbed into the Xhosa identification, and you see the images of women always in Xhosa attire, especially of the rural areas and those more figure or portrait series. There you see the kind of influence. Again, I don't want to predetermine and say it had some particular symbolism to her identity as Mfengu, and therefore being in this environment of being the community that gets absorbed by the Xhosa community. It's an area I think is very interesting to examine.
Yes, and I was reading that there were some also. I think in one of your articles you were talking about the mural painting, which was found later. So she was also working with murals in her work, or so she expanded just beyond the canvas, if I understood well.
Well, in my imagination, and this is my imagination probably going wild, there's a lot of reference to her in newspaper articles of she would get a headache, and every time she gets a headache, she would just paint almost the entire night. And so when Gemangole Lehulera was speaking to his aunt, she described that this woman was almost under understood as almost insane, and she painted her house had this mural. And so when he was able to get this conservator who could peel the paint of her, also in her CV, there's a mural for the Bantu Education Department, which I could not track down. It's listed as one of the things she had done as mural painting. So I think, again, there's a world there that might be impossible to find at this stage, but it seemed so that almost every surface for her was a potential canvas.
Amazing. Also, we know that she evaluated in a moment which there was very little access for Black community to education. So you mentioned the missionary schools, which were, if I understood, like separated from school for the white students. So can you talk a little bit more about the different, how do you imagine her as a self-taught artist in this context of having so little access to education, and also what was available for artists like herself, for the community, the Black community, to learn and to show the work during that time?
I think she was fortunate and quite clever in the way that she positioned herself. So with South Africa, the beginning of the I suppose quite earlier, colonialism was still kind of testing its limits. You have the growth of the missionary schools, which were not restricted in the way that they were thinking about education. In fact, it's one of the ruptures that often gets cited, in the sense that artists who found themselves learning from missionary schools learned in the same sense. Similar education was taught elsewhere in the world, until, of course, in 1948, where apartheid Bantu education, which then dimmed education that Black people were able to access. So you have a generation of artists that their imagination, their use of skill, the artistic training was far more complicated and sophisticated, that later on you see that coming through. And so that exposure, including with that of her grandmother, somehow situates her practices in an interesting place. You hear, of course, when you read the archive, that she, even in her teaching in school, experimented with a whole range of materials, things that she, yes, maybe kind of would have discovered herself, but does not necessarily speak to an artist who would have purely been self-taught. Then, of course, you also see that the influence, how she gets her first exhibition. In fact, she had a neighbor, Ethel Dlamini, who worked for the deputy chair of the Liberal Party. And this is how she gets the access to Liberal Party. It was Ethel who then spoke to Randall Vine, who was the chair at the time, that I have this friend who makes art, and I see you like art in your house. Can you give her an opportunity? And that suddenly plugged into a community of international communities that would have been making these references to international artists in relation to her work. This also meant that her opportunities as an artist was quite different, which also irritated critiques, as I mentioned, that who is she? Why is she liked by so many of these liberal groups? It made her suspicious, but it also made her seize opportunities that many artists who were mostly in Joburg at the time didn't really have. So there's something really exceptional about the way that she got positioned, unlike many artists of that time.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much. I think we're going to have to move to our next speaker, but I'll see you after the last presentation. Thank you so much. And now I will invite Skye to join us for the final presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're excited to learn more about Lalitha Lajmi from India. Let me just say a few words about you. Skye Arundhati Thomas is a curator, writer, and editor from India. their latest book, an anthology of writing and art, Palestine is Everywhere, is co-published by TBA 21, Silver Press, and the 87 Press. Pleasure Gardens, co-written with Isabella Scott, was published by MacBooks in 2024, as was a book on the painter Lalitha Lajmi by Steinberg Press. From 2021 to 2024, they were co-editor of the White Review. They have previously curated shows at the Galerie Anne Barraud in Paris and Beaux-Arts de Paris. So thank you so much, Skye, for joining us. It's a privilege to have you and to have you introduce us to the world of Lalitha Lajmi.
My name is Skye, and I'm a writer, and I guess I should really preface this presentation with what that means. And I guess what that means is I go out looking for stories that suit sort of certain ambitions or arguments or interests of my own. And thank you, Nontobeko, also for such an interesting manner by which you presented your own lens and your own sort of rubric by which you perform your research and your curatorial work. And I often think about a lot of this too, and I try to stay as honest as possible. And to put it very simply, I guess, as a writer or as like an art critic, what I can be really honest about is that I look for myself in work, as we all kind of do. And I think this is what sort of drove me to the painter that I'd like to speak today, Lalitha Lajmi, in the manner by which she sort of investigates selfhood itself. Lots of selfhood there. So I saw Lalitha's work for the first time at the National Gallery of Art in Bombay in a quite a beautiful show curated by Sumesh Sharma, who had worked with her for several years, all the way kind of leading up to her death. And she actually died just around when the show opened. And I never got to meet her myself. I was never in any kind of social circle with her. She was, I believe in her 90s when she passed away. So she was, of course, from a very different generation to me. And actually the generation that she was from is of great interest to me because it was a generation of artists working really at the brink of the Indian independence movement, and just as India began to form itself as a nation state. And so I thought I would just kind of run through a little bit around what that time was like. And I think, we had the Rousseau presentation earlier, and I think it's important to say that, kind of colonial enterprises were often also representational exercises. And so when new nations are born, they have to do a great kind of narrative building around representation. And Lalitha Lajmi was a painter sort of articulating a visual identity around the time that artists were really actively recruited to the project of nation building. So her contemporaries, were kind of being invited by the first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, for instance, to kind of paint big murals or participate in, public art projects, and very much to kind of fashion an Indian identity. Whereas Lalitha, on the other hand, only seemed to paint herself. And this show that I went to see, in which she is a completely prolific painter, and kind of makes incredible etchings, drawings, watercolors. She had this very vast and enormous body of work, and almost in all of her works, she represented herself. And I got completely sort of taken by this person, and this kind of and this almost like self-fabulous impulse of painting herself over and over again. And I was asked by Steinberg Press to sort of pitch a book around the same time, and I knew immediately I wanted it to be about her, and I also knew immediately that I wanted to set myself a very specific task, which is to use only her watercolor paintings and her diaries, which I was given access to by her family, as my kind of primary modes of research. I didn't want to be swayed by kind of critical opinion of her work in the way that it was received while she was like practicing and exhibiting as, you know, an artist in this kind of milieu of Bombay, you know, which was a very particular type of, say, you know, quote unquote modernist legacy within the Indian subcontinent. It's also the birthplace of Bollywood. And Lalitha's brother was in fact one of Bollywood's kind of very legendary early filmmakers, Guru Dutt. And he also sort of made films that were quite critical of nation building or the national project. So here was Lalitha in this kind of artistic milieu, and she has this one series called the Performer Series, which is out of which, you know, here is one example, and you see her paint herself in kind of several iterations. You see this kind of, you know, very like performative aspect, of course, and then some symbolic registers that repeat frequently through her paintings, such as birds and masks and these kind of nymph-like kind of goddess hybrid creatures. And I sort of kind of wanted to show another image from the series and draw some attention specifically to her use of only two colors. So she painted these watercolors very quickly, quite rapidly, almost like notes or sketches or sort of drafts. And she painted often, usually in using either red or blue, which in sort of traditional watercolor is how a painter determines the density of light within the pictorial plane, with red sort of being kind of warmer and blue the cooler tones. And, you know, these paintings would more typically be considered an underpaintings, to which an artist would kind of go back and fill in with more opaque pigments. I guess we're speaking about her today in this kind of rubric of the self-taught artist, and she did teach herself to paint, and she did also go on to teach others to paint, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why she stayed with color in this way, or as I try to kind of dig into in the book, I see a clear link between her watercolors and her diary entries, the two kind of foundational items of this book this slim book that I went on to write. And so Lalitha was in this very kind of cosmopolitan, you know, very glamorous sort of milieu at one end through her proximity to Bollywood, through her brother, but then also she was, you know, kind of had a kind of arranged marriage. She, you know, had her children, and you know, she kind of painted at night in a makeshift sort of setup by her kitchen, and she only much later on went on to see some kind of recognition around her artworks. But at around age, I think in his mid-30s, her brother very mysteriously died, and this was extremely heartbreaking for Lalitha, after which point she started to undergo psychoanalysis. And this was quite unusual, and I guess in a way very kind of telling of her kind of class position, and also her proximity to a certain kind of urban landscape, that she would venture into this kind of very foreign and modern type of experimental therapy. And one of the things that she started to do was to keep dream journals. And in her journals, you know, I found references where she does specifically say that her watercolors were the next step or the culmination of her journal writing. What I found, oh, this is a picture of the book. So for the book, I kind of set myself up the task of writing a story, not only of this painter through evidence that she left behind, that only she left behind, her own voice, whether through the written word or through this kind of very specific painterly one and her use of watercolor in this way. But as you know, I tried to admit in the very start, my bias is I also wanted to return to this moment in Indian history and try to write about it in some kind of critical fashion or in some kind of, don't necessarily want to use the word revisionism, but definitely to go back in order to look forward or in order to look at the present tense in a more specific way. I think there's a certain sort of fervor, revolutionary potential that gets ascribed to moments of decolonization. And yet, at least in the case of India, it was very much a transfer of power from, empire to a certain type of ruling class. And in fact, the nation state was born under certain conditions that have exacerbated to a very violent present tense. And so my writing is really always been an attempt to write history in a kind of simultaneous, continuous manner, and to take artists very seriously as historians, as builders and makers of archives through their own capacity. And I was so completely taken by this woman who fashioned a selfhood for herself in public, who wrote so candidly around, the heaviness and the loneliness of her own femininity, who in fact in her paintings had a very kind of progressive and interesting perspective on gender and body, and oftentimes you see her kind of prepare a tableau of a sort of typical nuclear family unit in the way that was really being presented at this kind of time of modernity, and be quite critical of it, and sort of be quite critical and show herself as, layered up with many levels of the sort of feminine, and accompanied by these avian creatures, and that seem to me to have quite like knowing smiles. So I think what I really wanted to do was to think through what Lalitha's writing was trying to say about a time also in history in which artists were not only kind of fashioning a language of themselves, but also towards a kind of larger project of fashioning a language for what Indian modernity looked like, or what the modern Indian metropolitan, cosmopolitan subject was preoccupied with. And while her contemporaries, as I said before, were kind of very willingly participating in the project of nation building, Lalitha was kind of building herself or her immediate surroundings with a deeply kind of critical perspective. So here's a kind of excerpt. Well, actually, it's a newspaper clipping. Sometimes she wrote in the newspaper, and she wrote very beautifully and very simply. And I sort of wanted to share some of her voice with you. I hope you can sort of read it. She writes, "Our inner life is a world of its own. I have been thinking about the erotic element in life for a long time. It was September last year when I finally started making the drawings reproduced here. I would rather that the viewer gave them his or her own interpretation." Of course, I did take that as an invitation, but I enjoyed that Lalitha had this very beautiful manner by which to kind of invite people into her work. And even with her diaries, I got this extremely strong sense that she wanted them to be read somehow, that there was a kind of sense in which she wrote in order to be read, and she constructed scenes, and the ways in which her diaries are sometimes written is she'll recount a dream, she'll recount the experience of waking up from it and then reflecting on it, and then sort of also provide an analysis and sometimes leave that analysis open-ended as if to invite kind of interpretation. And there was something very kind of and energetically kind of expansive about this person's mind that allowed for interpretive mechanisms to enter her inner world. And perhaps psychoanalysis offered this, and certainly it was perhaps a window into discursive practices that allowed this. So one of the series of works also that I get into a little bit are her etchings, and specifically etchings that kind of have recurring masks or kind of disembodied figures, or here, as you see, overlapping bodies and tangled bodies. And she writes, of course, about them in very interesting ways. She says, as I went on peeling the masks within me, I discovered new worlds. And I kind of started to think about how while India was sort of fashioning itself a selfhood, what does it mean to review someone's selfhood in parallel or in tandem? What if the modern Indian subject wasn't one that, built grand cities made of concrete at the invitation of French architects, or sort of kind of painted wistful scenes of nostalgia of some kind of indigeneity, or from a very urban kind of upper caste perspective. But there was something a bit more truthful here, something a bit more kind of honest and meaningful, in which here was someone kind of in the throes of building an actual life under the modern condition, who produced an enormous body of commentary around the pressures and burdens of kind of what it meant essentially to be a woman at such a time, to be in a family unit at such a time, to be an artist who kind of had to scurry away her creative life, to the interstices of time that kind of allowed her to explore them. Here's another very beautiful painting in which Lalitha sort of lifts up a mask, and there's a manner by which she paints figures also, I thought, to draw attention to, where she always kind of paints from this side profile, and to a certain extent I feel eyes, nose, mouths, the shape, the kind of like moon-like shape of many of the faces are quite interchangeable. Her hands are always kind of drawn in the same way. And perhaps this is to do with, also the speed at which she works, but I think it also has to do with how interchangeable she kind of allows her figures to be, and how much she kind of overlaps different roles and sort of articulates them not as these, fixed, immovable, solid constructs of identity, but identity itself as this sort of prism in which, in the modern family relations, what kind of opened up as exercises of kind of critical investigation. So here's an install shot from a show that we did in Paris of Lalitha's work at the invitation of Anne Barrault, a really visionary gallerist in the Parisian landscape, who really took a chance on a kind of erstwhile fairly kind of unknown artist, with this, especially within a European landscape, and sort of kind of understood the importance and the validity of bringing the story to life at this time also of this kind of heightened national identification. India, in the way that it begins to be represented, not only during this kind of immediate moment after empire, but the way that we see it also represented today, where there still exists this sort of tendency to self-exoticize, or this tendency to provide sort of representative tokens that an audience can like very quickly understand and assimilate to be a certain kind of Indianness. And Lalitha really defies that. She has a language of her own. She has a palette of her own. She has a landscape of her own. I find this etching very beautiful. It's of course quite surreal as well. And I think the dream analysis and of course the psychoanalysis lends itself very nicely to a more surreal tableau. And I also sort of tried to position her within a larger landscape of other writers, and of whom she mentions Eunice de Souza, a poet, who she kind of says, she encounters her in a dream one day, and she speaks to Eunice about her daughter. And I kind of went back to de Souza's writings, and I find her like very funny and very sharp, and she was also quite blasphemous. In fact, the St. Peter's Church in Bandra, which is the kind of main Catholic suburb of Bombay, issued her many stern warnings and said that, St. Peter's itself would kind of ban her. And, yet she went on in her kind of sharp, wistful way. And I love that Lalitha places herself in the landscape as this other kind of, not exactly antagonist, but this kind of very critical woman figure who didn't, politely play by the rules or take the kind of tools that she was given and exercise them in the same kind of way that everyone else was. And I love to think of this landscape in which, painters like Lalitha and poets like Eunice de Souza were, in fact, fashioning a kind of Indian modernity, sort of separate to the story that gets most often told elsewhere. I think to sort of kind of end or wrap up, and I'd love to kind of receive questions, is perhaps to think about in a soft, tender, introspecting way, what Lalitha's paintings sort of try to say to us as we view them so many years later, and certainly for me, with all of these different lenses that I come to with it. I find that Lalitha offers a historical telling that centers a kind of introspection, a kind of self-fabulous style, an authorship, a charisma, a style, some flair that produces a modern subject that is no longer kind of burdened with some of the representational aesthetics that we see still being discussed when it comes to India or like Indian modernity, and I thought to sort of thank her for that, and sort of mention that it's been a really rich and rewarding experience to sit with these works and really to see what someone left behind and try to articulate a bigger, larger, sort of more ambitious history through that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Skye, for introducing us to the work of Lalitha Lajmi, and also for replacing her in a very much larger project and context. So this was very fascinating. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how did you arrive to this connection between the self-portraits of Lalitha and also this idea of the representative of the mother India that you mentioned in the book, and yes, how did you come to this connection, and how did you build the context for reading the work in a much more interpretive and maybe personal way?
Thank you. So yes, I make this connection very explicitly between the mother figure that we see repeat several times in Lalitha's work and Mother India. which was, as I was mentioning at the time, that India was so-called born. And this great, incredibly diverse land was sort of forcibly homogenized under one identity, aegis. A very sort of neat narrative building project began. And a part of it, and this is seen in nationalist movements elsewhere in other kind of post-colonial contexts, is this comparing of the land to the mother figure. And so Mother India was this, rhetorical device used by the first leaders of the country, and there were many political kind of movements after that, and sort of what it kind of allowed was for the Mother India to necessitate patriarchal protectors of the land, the so-called fathers of the nation to come in, and then for the sons to be recruited as defenders of the mother through, say, like very literally military service. And so I also thought it interesting that at the same time that Lalitha is kind of painting her, these self-portraits that so heavily feature a mother figure, the mother was such a hotly kind of nationalist project. And what might it mean to tear that away from the hands of the nationalists and kind of sit with the way that, in some ways, Lalitha's paintings, at least to me, are quite critical of normative models of motherhood and quite critical of the normativity of the sort of modern nuclear family unit. I think she has a really expansive sort of perspective on gender and desire, and she wrote about it in the newspaper, which is a kind of highly transgressive thing to do. And I felt in that impulse something much more fascinating and valuable, and again a sort of an entry point to start telling this history through to me what is a more interesting sort of lens, and perhaps a less violent one too.
Thank you. Yes. Also, as we are in this context of like self-taught art at the Museum of Folk Art Museum, as you mentioned, and so she's read also today through that lens, and how you also look at the work as some as a way to think about India, the modern project, in a very non-normative way. So I was wondering if you could if you thought about this relationship between her being self-taught, working on her own terms, and this non-normative, very alternative view on selfhood, on also on motherhood, as you just mentioned, and also like female desire and experience.
Of course. I think perhaps maybe because Lalitha didn't have the type of artistic education that was being rolled out elsewhere at the time, she was maybe shielded or protected with some of the formal preoccupations that her contemporaries were kind of engaging with. And the tendency of the modernists, and again, the women really stand apart to me as the ones who did a far more interesting job of it, was to look back to Indian artistic traditions, craft technologies, erstwhile, cultural histories, in order to find a precedent to form an artistic language for an Indian future. And it's an exercise that then gets written about later as Indian modernism, as with modernisms that get classified elsewhere around the world in other post-colonial contexts, as being these moments where newly fashioned modern subjects became self-cognizant of their own relationship essentially to Europe, and reproduce new languages based on traditional kind of inspiration that could be easily identifiable and legible to a kind of Western history of art. And of course, I find the framing of modernism in that way really problematic. So I wanted to sort of take the word modern and present it with a slightly different tinge in terms of what it meant to be a kind of modern subject. That it was not about a kind of representational modernity, but a sort of lived experience of modernity itself, and modernity not as being, you know, this great pinnacle of kind of enlightenment, but actually modernity as the moment of decolonization, modernity as the moment of like forcible like nationhood, and the creation of kind of urban centers that had to suddenly articulate artistic languages that, you know, became representative of thousands of people that, you know, never visited the cities themselves. So I think it's a very complex thing, and I wanted to try and, you know, start to break open some of that. And again, just do it as a writer. You know, I'm not a scholar, but I have an interest in history, and I have a desire to write in simple, clean, interesting ways. And so I try to meet those two things together. And in Lalitha, I found a sort of you know, precedent in my own preoccupations, because she also sort of seemed to be critical, or at least perhaps if not critical, did not engage in those languages, and existed in a world that to me seems to be all of her own making.
Yeah, so at least, yeah, working outside what is pre-existing or what is mostly circulating at that time. Thank you so much. I think we have a little bit of a few more minutes before the program closes. So I'd love Nancy and Nontobeko to join us for maybe a final question. I'll kick us off and see if anyone on the call wants to ask questions for our Swiss speakers. And then, yes, so and we were just talking about this also with you, Skye, this also really thinking also about the experience of a mother, of a woman. And so I was thinking a lot about Nontobeko's own perspective, thinking about feminist archiving practices. And so altogether, I feel like there's this sense of trying to work with archives that are not totally given, and kind of playing with it. And so I would love for you maybe, I think one thing that you know is shared among all these is artists, is that they didn't leave like clear archives, and then you have to really excavate them and retrieve them, question them. And so if you can talk a little bit more about those absences and gaps in your research, in how it's played in each, in your respective process research.
Oh, am I supposed to
Yeah,
start?
it's like it's a question for the three of you, because that's kind of a way to connect the three presentations. As you this you know, you all questioned the archives and kind of came to a new way of understanding the works through this archiving, or at least this new way of thinking about what is left from the artist and dealing with that. So if you can start, Nontobeko, because I mentioned your feminist perspective that is very clear in your presentation.
And as the troublemaker of mentioning this, I will start. I think what is quite clear, I think, for all of us, or at least for my work, is that perhaps, well, there was never a consolidated archive to begin with. These artists were always producing work, leaving their studios, that fantasy, that is only in the kind of fantasy to consolidate that. And it's a work of curatorial work that tries to reimagine what that might look like. How does that give us a body of a person, or a body of work that the person has made over time, which in reality they themselves wouldn't have seen in this kind of sense. And being able to then knit that together in spaces where it's hard to find. It's always interesting that one starts with very little, but it's almost as if the universe listens and something connects to the next piece, to the next piece. As I was putting together this presentation, and I reread the self-written autobiography, I realized she said something about fire, and I saw a work. I was like, wait a minute, I think I'm making a link to a work that the University Museum tried to buy a few years ago. It's ever growing, and I think that's the fascination of its absence, that is not permanent. And I think that kind of stance of thinking about there's something out there that could potentially lead to discovering more about the artist is what I look forward to all the time.
I think it's Nontobeko's observation there really made me think that one of the senses I've got increasingly working on Rousseau over the years is how much is in the works themselves. You get frustrated that there isn't in Rousseau's case, that there isn't one place to go to for the letters. He didn't explain too much about what his pictures meant. He gave us little bits and pieces, but it's often more suggestive than not. But it really does bring you back to the object. And I've become increasingly interested in process, but I think it also is a way of trying to bring in the artist's voice in a way, when that's hard to do across history or across, various contemporary barriers. But it is the gift of being an art historian. And to Skye's point in her talk, this sense of acknowledging the sort of personal route into it, but then actually, using that to an analytical advantage.
I guess, as I sort of tried to say at the very start, I did want to be very honest about my own, I guess bias is one word. Perhaps there's others that are less damning than that. But I think because Lalitha was so generous in leaving all this material behind, and I did have actual diaries, which were, very kind of intimate things to receive. I feel she was a very beautiful kind of subject to take on and spend time with for the sort of year and a half that I did, because I did really have like a direct access to her thinking. But then also, that being said, she was, to me at least, quite a self-fabulist, and that was very much part of the artistic practice and is very visible in the work. She really wanted to be a dancer. And she sort of wasn't allowed because of the kind of traditional hierarchies in the house in which she grew up, and so she then goes on to paint these hundreds of watercolors in which she's performing in one way or another. And I think she had this kind of temperament about her. So I also had to see that where I had to kind of see that she was kind of telling the story through even her most intimate thinking. And in fact, I found that really quite fun and interesting. And I could tell also that I was dealing with a very sharp mind that was at all times in such great control of how it was being perceived. And as a writer, of course, I really enjoyed that. As I guess that's something we all try to aspire to do.
Yes, thank you. That's great. Also, we can see that actually after you were talking, I thought they actually left a lot of archives, which it's the work itself. It's the archive, and it's great to be reminded that we should work from that work, as Nancy mentioned, as the best ground of the work, just looking and observing and describing the work, which you do in the book, Skye. Maybe to just end, one more question that kind of build on this idea of the agency of the artist. You started, Nancy, with a presentation on the retrospective, which is called The Painter's Secrets, and Lajmi's favorite figure in the work is is the trickster. And I think we also talk with Nontobeko about the way that the artist doesn't really fit into any categories and kind of like manage to find visibility in a way that is really unusual. So I was thinking a lot about how those artists navigated in their own way, in a very special way, the art system. And so if you can talk a little bit more about this idea of how they cross boundaries, and if you could see them or describe them as trickster, which is something I think have been also mentioned about Rousseau, that he was kind of playing with the avant-garde, playing with his clients. So if there's anything there that is of interest to you, and if it's a figure that feels relevant to understand the artist and their work.
And certainly with Rousseau, I've found that helpful, but I think the caution I've had in that is I see it more as something that's born of necessity. You know, Rousseau didn't enjoy some of the privileges that, for instance, a private income. So he had to make money. He had to be different things to different people at times. Some of that I think was just being savvy. It doesn't necessarily mean that those contradictions are always devious. I think there are some sort of clear instances where he was just simply being duplicitous, the bank fraud being one of them. He very clearly gets involved in opening bank accounts in false names, and it's hard to believe that he didn't know what he was up to with that. But again, you do feel some sympathy because he had money worries. Some of his admirers say that he had the suit of clothes he was wearing, and that was pretty much it. So it's again, I think it is important to factor in class and social position and societal prejudice, whether they're gender, ethnicity, religious, whatever it might be, because these do impact the way that people move through society. They have done, they do, and it's not to diminish what they're doing, what people are doing. I think this is really important to bring out. It doesn't detract from the wonder of their works. If anything, it makes it more extraordinary that they were able to achieve what they did. But it is it's a factor that you can't get around.
I guess I quite literally write about Lalitha as a trickster figure in the book. I guess I see a trickster figure recur in her paintings, primarily through, of course, her own self, but also a kind of, a something hybrid around a clown, a dancer, a nymph, and I find the trickster as a literary trope so interesting because I guess a trickster comes in when perhaps the protagonist or in a divergent moment in a story in which a kind of moral ambiguity or a sort of gray zone has to be further underscored, whether through jest or through like a devilish trick or something a little bit mischievous and naughty, and I really enjoy that in a story, that rupture or that moment at which everything is forced to turn its head on itself, and often to have characters like that that are morally kind of ambiguous, that are sort of a little bit ambivalent and not so precise, especially in this time where we're so kind of overrun with binaries. And so to me, the trickster proved an insightful kind of trope, or figure of the canon by which to read an artist in the way that she presented herself. And also to think through what that might mean for us as viewers, for the trickster to repeatedly present herself to us. What is she sort of trying to say so directly to her viewer? And I think it was, kind of sometimes pointed attempt to ask the viewer to think through their own prejudice or their own kind of gendered assumption or their own relation to a certain type of normativity, and I sort of really kind of enjoyed that almost direct confrontational nature that Lalitha's artwork sometimes takes.
I think from the perspective of Gladys, it's quite interesting that it's actually happening in a moment where historically being bold and being confrontational is at the center of everything that's happening around her. And so being able to boldly take on this position of being the artist, making claims in newspapers that you are the first, somehow positioned her navigating a world where you kind of had to rise above a sea of a place to kind of draft your visibility, and being able to stand out meant that you were kind of one, comfortable in your body, but also daring enough. I remember reading a lot of the times in the newspapers where one time she broke her arm, and then there's an article on the newspaper saying the artist is playing tennis with the broken arm. And somehow, when does she rush to wherever situation where she's photographed with the sling of her arm? You know, who's imagining these who's encouraging her to kind of be assertive in the press in this particular way. One newspaper also said, you know, she's big, she's bold. She, in a way that kind of created a frightening image of this woman that could probably bulldoze in a room and walk over you. But that also kind of made you think, wow, then somehow she had a sense of presence, and was able to navigate. It's wild to me to think of the 60s and to think of a woman in that sense, because we've just been ushered out of, well, women having stood up to a past system and had gone to march and had been visible in that way. But did that mean that every woman kind of felt that they had this kind of strong agency to go into the world and claim a place? Which other woman artists was she looking at? So where did she get the sense of autonomy was for me an interesting thing to think about. Artists of her caliber and navigating that world. Yeah, I could say that about kind of thinking about visibilities. That I think also what we are asked to tend with, and I think we're all doing this, is that we're dealing with visibilities as opposed to invisibilities. And so what kind of visibility do they offer us as opposed to this disposition of saying someone visible in a system?
Thank you so much for these final thoughts and about visibility. I think we learned a lot from you all today, and I'm going to close with a big thank you to the three of you for joining us today and sharing your research with us. I would like also to thank Richard, who our IT director, who's always behind the scene supporting us. And I would like also to thank everyone who joined us today for this conversation. I hope this presentation have inspired you to come to see the museum. We are reopening on April 10 with 2 new exhibitions with based on our collection, Self-Made, A Century of Inventing Artists and Folk Nation Crafting Patriotism in the United States. And also, I hope you will consider making a donation to the museum following this program, as your support has a great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of self-taught artists. And we continue to offer programs online, so please visit EFAM's website. And thank you again, and see you very soon. And thank you again to the three of you for joining.